This is the philosophy of Saint Albert the Great, and we will start with this short introduction. Saint Albert the Great, or Albertus Manius, is regarded as one of the most universal thinkers during the Middle Ages. And because of his encyclopedic mind, he was called the Great, even in his lifetime, by his contemporaries. St. Albert's interest ranged from natural science all the way to theology, way more than his famous student, St. Thomas Aquinas. He made contributions to logic, psychology, metaphysics, meteorology, mineralogy, and zoology. He was a tireless commentator on nearly all the great authorities read during the 13th century, from Aristotle to Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite to Averroes, Avicenna, just the many um, commentators of his time. He was deeply involved in an attempt to understand the importance of the thought of Aristotle in an organized manner, and he exerted efforts to paraphrase and make commentaries on all available works of Aristotle. By the way, when you make commentaries is actually uh, it's your own lecture, but while reading the primary text, you also give your own explanations. So it's a lecture on the works of a particular thinker. Such effort to organize the works of Aristotle was distinct from the Arab commentators who had incorporated their own ideas into the study of Aristotle. Yet, he also showed appreciation of the Arab commentators by using some of their outstanding ideas in developing his own ideas in philosophy. His superior understanding of a diversity of philosophical texts allowed him to construct one of the most remarkable syntheses in medieval culture. Although there are also commentators who would say that he was not a commentator or a synthesizer, but more of a compiler of works. We will see that comment later on. Now let's go to the life of Saint Albert the Great. Saint Albert the Great was born into a knightly family sometime around the year 2000s. Some historians place it at 1199. He was born in Lauingen, Germany, formerly Swabia. He joined the then recently founded Order of Preachers in 1223, and he joined while he was a student at the University of Padua. He joined through the invitation of Blessed Jordan of Saxony, the first successor of Saint Dominic as the master of the Order of Preachers, and whose preaching was remarkably effective in encouraging university students to join the order. Apparently, the Dominicans made their campaigns in the universities. St. Albert's decision to enter the Dominican order was opposed by his family. After entering the Dominican order, he was then sent to Cologne in order to complete his training for the order. He finished this training as well as a course of studies in theology by 1228. He then began teaching as a lector at many Dominican houses of studies: Cologne, Hildesheim, Fribourg, Regensburg, and Strasbourg. Sometime between 1241 and 1242, St. Albert was sent to the University of Paris to complete his theological education. While studying, he was also lecturing, and lecturing here means making his commentaries on the sentences of Peter Lombard. So we know from our lecture on Saint Bonaventure that the sentences of Peter Lombard was considered to be the official text in theological courses. He also started writing his six-part Summa Paranciens, dealing with the sacraments of the church, the incarnation and the resurrection of Christ, human nature, among other topics. In 1245, he received his degree as Master of Theology and began to teach theology at the university. It was around this year that St. Thomas Aquinas was sent to Paris to study under him. St. Thomas was under his direction for the next 3 years. In fact, St. Thomas would be under St. Albert the Great for almost more or less 7 years, including his theological studies. In 1248, St. Albert was appointed Regent of Studies at the newly created Studium Generale by the Dominican orders in Cologne. So St. Albert, together with St. Thomas Aquinas and other students, left Paris and went to Cologne. St. Thomas continued his studies under St. Albert in Cologne and also served as Magister Studium in the school until 1252. Then St. Thomas returned to Paris to take up his teaching duties while St. Albert remained in Cologne. In Cologne, he began to work on a vast project of paraphrasing each of the known works of Aristotle. It was also about around this time that he started working and researching on natural philosophy. In 1254, St. Albert was elected the prior provincial for the German-speaking province of the Dominican Order. This position mandated that St. Albert the Great spend more time for traveling throughout the province, meaning throughout Germany, visiting Dominican convents, priories, and even a Dominican mission in Riga. In this post, he tended with great care to the needs of the Dominican friars in 36 priories, together with many monasteries of Dominican nuns in Germany, Austria, Belgium, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. And this task occupied St. Albert until 1256. That year, he returned to Cologne, but he left the same year for Paris in order to attend a general chapter of the order wherein the controversy regarding the position of the mendicants to teach in the university was being challenged. This is the controversy involving the mendicants and the secular masters. The secular masters uh, passed a statute, a university statute, that affected the career, the teaching careers of the mendicants. At the time, the mendicants held 3 chairs, two for the Dominicans and one for the uh, Franciscans. And they were gaining reputation, good reputation to the students of the university, such that the students preferred to attend their classes, their lectures, instead of attending the lectures of the secular masters. So that's the controversy surrounding the mendicants' position in the university. Okay? In fact, St. Thomas was not admitted immediately. St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure were not admitted outright to the master circle because of this controversy. Now, while engaged on this controversy, St. Albert completed his refutation of Averroistic psychology with his work De Unitate Intellectus contra Averroistas. He afterwards departed again for another tour of the province of Germany. In 1257, he was relieved of his duties as prior provincial and returned again to Cologne as regent of studies. This his old assignment in the Studium Generale and continued to teach until 1259. While there, he also uh, was involved in a discussion about the curriculum of the scholastic program used by the Dominican order. And this discussion about the curriculum of the scholastic program was actually uh, done together with St. Thomas Aquinas and other fellow Dominicans. In 1260, St. Albert was consecrated bishop of the church, and he was sent to Ratisbon, now it's called Regensburg, in order to undertake a reform of abuses in that diocese. He occupied this position until 1263, when Pope Urban IV relieved him of his duties and asked him to preach the crusade in the German-speaking countries, a duty that he performed until 1264. After that, he went to the city of Würzburg, where he stayed until 1267. And he would spend the next 8 years traveling around Germany, conducting various ecclesiastical tasks, either from his order or from the Pope. In 1274, while he was traveling to the Council of Lyons, St. Albert received the sad news of the untimely death of St. Thomas Aquinas, his friend and former student of many years. According to some writings, he was saddened when St. Thomas, whom he called the fountain and glory of creation, died. After the council, St. Albert returned to Germany. And 3 years after that, in 1277, he traveled again to Paris to defend St. Thomas's teachings, which was under attack at the university. Um, it was actually censored when the Bishop of Paris planned to condemn the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas. Although there are some questions whether he really did travel to Paris to defend St. Thomas, but recent scholarship would show that there are evidences to show that he went to Paris to defend the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas. In 1279, he anticipated his death and he drew up his own last will and testament. And true enough, on November 15, 1280, the following year, he died and he was buried in Cologne. On December 15, 1931, this is uh, almost 700 years, no? Pope Pius XI declared St. Albert both as a saint and a doctor of the church. And on December 16, 1241, Pope Pius XII declared St. Albert as a patron saint of the natural sciences. So over his long life, 80 years, St. Albert gave exceptional service as a Dominican, both as a teacher of theology and as an administrator. He also served the church. He maintained the simple lifestyle of a mendicant friar, even refusing to travel on horseback, but walking from place to place, gaining the nickname Boots the Bishop. And even in old age, he continued to be of service. So that's the life of St. Albert the great Dominican, the universal doctor. Now, let's focus now on his philosophy, his philosophical endeavors. I divide this into two because St. Albert, while I'm going to focus on his philosophical endeavors, I will also highlight some of his scientific endeavors. The dominant commitment in St. Albert's life was to research, to write, and to teach. He wrote about three important theological subjects: prayer, the Eucharist, and Our Lady, and just about any philosophical topics. As a student in Padua, University of Padua, Saint Albert had encountered the works of Aristotle even before he entered the Dominican order. And he wrote commentaries on nearly all of Aristotle's works, paraphrasing them, organizing them, sort of systematizing them. He believed that the use of Aristotle's philosophies would be especially useful in developing the positive Christian vision that understands human life as grace perfecting nature. So with St. Thomas, he shared the view that with Aristotle, we can actually discover the truth about human nature or human life. Aristotle's view that the study of nature is autonomous in its own domain and worthy of pursuit in its own right fitted well with St. Albert's cast of mind, and he adopted the Aristotelian approach to the physical world. In some cases where he felt that Aristotle should have written or wrote something on this particular topic, but Aristotle did not write, St. Albert wrote about it himself just to cover the ground that Aristotle failed to cover, at least in his works. St. Albert's intellectual vision was immense. Aside from paraphrasing Aristotle, he also commented on Porphyry, Boethius, Peter Lombard, the one, of course, who wrote the sentences, Gilbert de la Porree, and Pseudo Dionysius. He also wrote a number of commentaries on the scriptures and the Bible, both the Old and the New Testaments. And in addition to all of this work of paraphrasing, commenting, lecturing on other thinkers' work, St. Albert also labored to prepare a kind of unified field theory of medieval Christian intellectual culture and wrote a number of works wherein he developed his own philosophical, scientific, and theological vision. So among his works are the Unitate Intellectus, Problemata Determinate, De Facto, the uh, Quinque Problematibus, De Natura Boni, De Sacramentis, De Incarnatione, De Bono, De Quatuor, Quavevis, De Homine, and of course, his unfinished Summa Theologiae. In the last 10 years of his life, St. Albert prepared a kind of philosophical encyclopedia. And true enough, he is called the universal doctor because of his encyclopedic learning. But the contribution of St. Albert the Great is not only in philosophy, because he's also active in his scientific endeavors. During his years in Cologne, and this is now his scientific endeavors, St. Albert undertook experiments in physics and chemistry in his makeshift laboratory. And because of these experiments and studies, his reputation as a scientist grew. So he was not just a philosopher, he was also a scientist. His endeavors included building up a collection of plants, insects, and chemical compounds. And he was also consulted about the design of Cologne's new cathedral. So he was also in architecture. In his youth, St. Albert loved the study of science, and he was very observant, particularly with regard to nature. And he always saw, loved, and taught the natural in the context of the supernatural. Now, his reputation as a scientist is based on two reasons. One, he examined and treated various topics that can be considered as part of the natural sciences, like botany, zoology, and astronomy. Second, he had a real scientific temperament because he based his research on observation, incorporating other researchers' results or studies when he is sure, of course, of their validity. And he never sought to infer from more from scientific data than possible. For his scientific work, he is considered to be the first scientist from the West and the greatest biologist since Aristotle. So his admiration for Aristotle is not only in the area of philosophy, but also in the area of the natural sciences. Saint Albert has the gift of acute powers of observation, the power of observation. When he traveled in the different parts of Europe, as he traveled a lot because he was assigned in the German uh, province of the Dominican order. So he traveled a lot. He always recorded extensively what he has observed in order that he may not miss anything that is worth seeing. He recorded details of fish in the river, in the Danube River, cattle, deer, birds, forest squirrels, and plants. In fact, uh, there was this description of Saint Albert of a squirrel. No? So he was noting the features, the physical features of the squirrel, and he compared the physical features of a squirrel from this place, found in this place, and a squirrel found in another place. Okay? So, of particular interest to St. Albert's is his observation of insects, the insects, because there were no available studies of the type of animals during his time. St. Albert was also responsible for anticipating by several centuries some of our most recent discoveries. His writings include the details of alchemy. There was actually a question whether he is an alchemist, but because he is not. Anthropology, architecture, astronomy, botany, climatology, chemistry, mechanics, meteorology, mineralogy, navigation, physics, psychology, weaving, and zoology. So these are the uh, areas in the sciences that interested Saint Albert the Great. So again, truly a universal and encyclopedic mind. Now, let us focus on his philosophy, on his ideas or thoughts in philosophy. So let's start with God, the knowledge of God in faith and reason. Saint Albert affirmed the possibility of attaining a certain knowledge about God by means of the light of natural reason. Thus, by a deeper understanding of the law of causality, as our senses perceive it in natural things, we can reach the notion of a first cause, of which everything depends. Of course, Aristotle have already posited that this first cause is God, but the God of Aristotle is not the personal God that Christianity believes in. This discursive knowledge provides us with a proof of God's existence. So this is what you call cosmological proof, proving God's existence from the natural things. But this proof of God's existence is not in the sense of a strict demonstration or strict conclusion, because it is impossible to obtain such a conclusion given the immensity of the divine essence. And add to this proof the inequality between the first cause and its proper effects. But St. Albert believed that it can certainly be a demonstration ad impossible, or an indirect conclusion, by showing how absurd the world would be without God. How can you posit a world without a creator? That's the point of St. Albert. In that way, the universal doctor surpasses the negative theology of pseudo Dionysius. While at the same time, he takes its merit. So, a knowledge that is certain but incomplete. We can develop a certain knowledge about God, but it will be an incomplete knowledge because of the immensity of the essence of the first cause, or of God. Now, this approach would lead his disciple, St. Thomas, to say that concerning the divine essence, we must consider the manner of his existence, or rather, what is not the manner of his existence. And such a strong statement indeed from someone like St. Thomas, who knew how to reach the ultimate conclusion of the questions about the formal or metaphysical nature of God, is truly remarkable. In St. Albert's mind, the via negationes, the negative, uh, via negativa, no? Negationes, necessarily implies an affirmation. So it means that by negating, you actually affirm. Okay? That enables us to discover through the powers of natural reason, albeit in an incomplete, confused fashion, some positive divine attributes. For example, immutability. So we can know through our powers the quality of, or the characteristic of, the immutability of God, or of the first cause, eternity and unicity. Nevertheless, the range of affirmative or positive theology is very limited, because what is proper to God, and first cause, what is really his essence, is beyond the reach of our natural faculties. Meaning, yes, we can attain certain knowledge about God, but God is way too much for us, way too much for our natural faculties. With merely pure reasoning, we are incapable of discerning anything in the inner life of God, in which the immutable is eternally communicated. The one engenders variety, and variety is resolved in unity. So it's immutable and eternal. It is one and yet multiplied. Okay, it is variety, but at the same time there is unity. It's diverse, but it is unified. So that alone is beyond the understanding of man based on his pure reasoning. Now, in line with Aristotle's philosophy, he clearly distinguished the objects of our knowledge. So there are types of knowledge that are in accordance with our intellectual capacity, and there are also other kinds of knowledge that totally surpass our intellectual capacity. Like, for example, the knowledge of the essence of God in itself. So, to achieve a knowledge of the divine essence, this is where he affirmed that we need the supernatural, or supernatural revelation, because there are things that far exceed our natural reasoning. We need revelation for us to know God. For example, to know God as subsisting in three distinct persons. So the Trinity is is a is a kind of the knowledge of the Trinity is something that cannot be achieved by man by simply relying on his natural reason. We need supernatural revelation in order to understand, in order to know God and the Trinity. Now, let's go to his metaphysics. Okay? It's a common idea that Saint Albert the Great truly admired Aristotle, but he was not just influenced by Aristotle's philosophy because he was also influenced by Neoplatonism. So his metaphysics is an adaptation of Aristotelian metaphysics as conditioned by a form of Neoplatonism. And this Neoplatonism was actually read or taken from his readings of the Book of Causes, the Liber de Causis. The Book of Causes is actually a book on Neoplatonist metaphysics. The author of this book is mysterious, it's unknown, although uh, the early in the early years they ascribe this Liber de Causis to Aristotle. But most of its contents are actually based on the elements of theology by Proclus. So this was initially attributed to Aristotle, but it was not Aristotle because it's actually uh, more of a Neoplatonist metaphysics. But just the same, Saint Albert thought that this text, this 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 book that he read, is an Aristotelian text, and that actually influenced his understanding of Aristotle. So apparently, Saint Albert never realized that the the book was actually of Neoplatonic origin, and it was not an Aristotelian work. No, it's not a book of Aristotle nor any of the Aristotelians. He also paraphrased the other works of Aristotle, and some of his paraphrasing of Aristotle are included in his book De Causes et Processo Universitatis. And he used this book, his own book, as a guide in interpreting the other works of Aristotle. At the same time, he also used the writings of Pseudo Dionysius to correct some of the doctrines found in the Liber de Causis. Okay? So you see here that he integrated three sources to develop his own metaphysics. Now, through an integration of these three main sources, he came up with a hierarchical structure of reality, wherein there is an emanation of forms directed by what St. Albert calls the summoning of the good. The summoning of the good. Now, this summoning of the good is very much similar to the Neoplatonic principle of return. No, we objects are summoned to the good, and it's pretty much like the return of the creatures to the source of goodness, who is God Himself. So, according to Albert the Great, the good operates metaphysically as the final cause of the order of forms in the universe of beings. At the same time, it is also the first cause. So it is both the final and the first cause. In the first cause, the origin, but because there is a summoning, there is a return, then it will be the final cause. So it's both the first, the starting point, and the last. First and the final cause. He explains that what exists is good. Sorry, I missed something here. What exists is good because God is good. No? What exists is good because God is good. And we are good insofar as we exist. And therefore, the balanced relation of the exit is the similar to the idea of the Neoplatonism of Augustine of the descent, no, the descent of God to the creatures, no? The exit, and then of course the return, principle of return. So that's similar of the things according to classical Neoplatonism is slanted in favor of the relationship of return. So he preferred more of the principle of the return. The summoning of the good is actually based on this principle of return, the summoning. No? As a Christian philosopher, he favors a creationist view of being over the doctrine of pure emanation of Neoplatonism. Of course, even Augustine uh, put a Christian bent rather, on this Neoplatonic idea of pure emanation. No? Okay. Now, he rejected in his metaphysics, he rejected the doctrine of universal hylomorphism espoused by the Franciscan scholastics. What is this universal hylomorphism? This is actually the basis of the idea of Bonaventure that created beings can have, or they do have, matter and form, including the spiritual beings. Okay, that's why it's called universal hylomorphism. All created beings, including the angels, they have matter and form. That's why Saint Bonaventure can talk about spiritual matter. Okay, that's the idea of universal hylomorphism espoused by the Franciscan scholastics. Okay? Of course, the the origin of that universal hylomorphism can be traced back to the idea of Saint Augustine, especially about his seminal reasons. Now, Saint Albert the Great rejected this doctrine of hylomorphism or universal hylomorphism. He argued that material beings are always composed of matter and form, in which the form are imperfectly formed until they are called forth by the ultimate good. The spiritual creatures, however, excluding man, of course, have no material element. They don't have material. So there's no such thing as spiritual matter. There's no such thing as a being composed of spirituality, materiality. The only exception to that is man, because man is composed of body and soul. But even then, the soul is pure spirit and the body is pure material. Okay? So, according to Albert the Great, the spiritual creatures have no material element, and their being summoned to the good is immediate and final. The summoning of the imperfectly formed or developed forms of material beings is not direct. It depends upon the intervention of the celestial spheres. We're going to talk about in a while about the celestial spheres. Okay. Now, again, the first cause, as understood as God, is an absolutely transcendent reality. That is the only uh, that is the only being where his essence and existence are not separate. His uncreated light, meaning this divine light of God, very much similar to the illumination of Augustine. calls forth a hierarchically ordered universe. So there is a hierarchically, the universe is orderly. There is a hierarchy wherein its order of beings reflects this uncreated light, the uncreated light of God. Now, at the top of this hierarchy of light are the purely spiritual beings. And what are these purely spiritual beings? These are the angels and the intelligences. Okay? So the angelic order and the intelligences. So there are two in the purely spiritual beings. You have the angels and the intelligences. And Saint Albert carefully distinguishes these two kinds of beings. He adapted the pseudo-Dionysius notion about the celestial hierarchy. Pseudo-Dionysius, in his celestial hierarchy, he conceived of a, or he portrayed, he depicted rather, the hierarchy of the angels, of the celestial sphere. So in that celestial sphere, you have the seraphim, the cherubim, the thrones, the dominions, powers, authorities, principalities, the angels, the archangels. So that's one order of spiritual beings. The intelligences move the cosmic sphere, meaning the universe. So there's the heavenly and then there's the cosmic. Okay? And they illuminate the human soul. The intelligences, like the order of angels, also form a hierarchy. Okay? So the first, the highest, is what St. Albert called the first intelligence. The first intelligence contemplates the entire universe, and of course, it uses the human soul. Then there is the lower intelligences, okay, that illumines all the rest, no, to draw all creatures into a unity. So you have the celestial sphere. The celestial sphere is divided into two. You have the two beings, two orders of being, the angels and the intelligences. Okay. And in the intelligences, you have the first intelligence and then the lower intelligences. Now, beneath this order of the spiritual beings, of the angels and the intelligences, are the souls that possess intellects. The souls. That includes there the human soul. They are joined, these souls are joined to the bodies, but do not depend on bodies for their existence. They are ordered to the first intelligences as to enjoin contemplative unity of the entire cosmos. So you have the souls, the human souls, joined to the body. Okay? Now, as to the nature of the intellect, Saint Albert rejected the Averroistic theory of the unity of the intellect, because Averroes posited that there is only one intellect. No? Now, according to Albert the Great, each soul has its own intellect. So there are many intellects as there are many souls or many human souls. But because the human soul is in a unique position, because it exists between the physical and the spiritual, no, because it is combined, joined with the body, it can operate as a microcosm, as a small universe, because it has both the spiritual and the material component. And therefore, it can serve the purpose of the first intelligence of binding all creatures into a universe, into a kind of harmony. Okay? And then, lastly, below the intellects, the souls, the intellects, you have the immersed forms. The immersed forms. And under this heading, St. Albert established another hierarchy, the animal kingdom, that's the in the philosophy of St. Thomas, that's the sentient, no? Or the sentient, the animal, the soul of the animals. And then the plant kingdom, so that will be the vegetative soul. And then the world of minerals, and finally the elements of material creation. Okay? So that's the hierarchy of beings uh, of Saint Albert the Great. Now, following, of course, the philosophies of Aristotle, of the Neoplatonists, and including uh, the Averroistic uh, metaphysics. Okay. Now, let's go to logic. Okay. So, one of Aristotle's works that Saint Albert commented on, he lectured on this, is the Organon. Okay. The Organon, uh, first, uh, we know that the Organon is a collection of the works of Aristotle. So it's not just one book, it's actually 6 works of Aristotle on logical matters. Um, Aristotle called it the Organon because it's supposed to be intended to be a tool or instrument for philosophical thinking. But the Organon reached the Latin thinkers uh, piece by piece. So first you have 3 books, and then the latter 3 books. I am not very. I forgot the title of the first 3 books, and then the latter 3 books that they they read. Uh, So he commented on the Organon, and he relied on his commentary and paraphrasing of this work in order to address one crucial problem that preoccupied the medieval thinkers. And this is the problem of the universals. Okay? So many medieval thinkers advanced their answer or their ideas, their thoughts about the nature of the universal. So the universal, the idea that is somehow common to all, no? That can be applied to all. No? So actually, because of the problem of the universals, it is difficult really to define what a universal is, precisely because they the medieval thinkers gave their own interpretation of what the universal is. But uh, I think it was Proclus who, yeah, who posited the question about the problem of the universals as that which, although it exists in one, no. So this is the definition of Albert the Great about the universals. He defined the term universal as that which, although it exists in one, is up by nature to exist in many. So it exists in one, but it can be applied to many. Okay? It exists as one, but it can be applied to many. Okay? So because a universal is one, but it is applicable to many, then it is predicable of the many. The many would be the particular things. Okay, like for example, man. Man exists in one, so we have an idea of man, and it can exist in one being, and at the same time, it can also be applicable to many. So man is me, you, the other human beings in the room, the other human beings in the other places of the planets, and so on. So that's the universal. Okay, it exists in one, but it can be applied to many. That's how Albert the Great defined the universal. And therefore, based on this, he distinguished three kinds of universal. Those that pre-exist the things that exemplify them. No? So it pre-exists in the thing that exemplify them. Meaning, if, for example, say in the future, uh, a tree would grow, but we already have an idea of a tree. So that idea of a tree pre-exists the tree that will exemplify it. Next, those that exist in individual things. So man, for example, already exists in men. Okay? And those that exist in the mind when abstracted from individual things. So I have in my mind the idea of a man. So when you say man, first, you can consider man as universale ante rem. So I already have the idea, like for example, uh, a building. What is a building? Well, a building could be applied to a future building that will be constructed. At the same time, it also exists in the actual buildings. And it also exists as a kind of idea, oh, of a building that's been abstracted from individual buildings. So these are the three distinctions of Albert about the universal. So in answering the question about the famous problem of the universals posed by Porphyry pala, not Proclus, no? So the question of Porphyry is this: do the species, meaning the universals, man, tree, and so on, according to which we classify beings, exist in themselves, or are they merely constructions of the mind? Do they have a separate existence? No? So the idea of man exists in itself, separate from the mind, or they are products of the mind. They are products here of the mind. So when I say man, it's just a product of my own conceptions. Okay? So that's the problem posed by Porphyry. Saint Albert, in replying to this question, he applied his threefold distinction, noting that a universal's mode of being, its existence, is differentiated according to which function it is being understood. So a universal may be considered in itself, or in respect to understanding our knowledge, or abstraction, or in respect to existing in one particular or another being. So universal in itself, the universal as construction of the mind, existing in the mind, or universal as existing in a particular object. So these are the three differentiations, the three uh, distinctions of the universals of Saint Albert the Great. And he applied that to the problem posed by Porphyry. Now, of course, if we follow the problem of the universals, especially in the medieval ages, there are many different answers to the problem of the universals. One answer to this problem of the universal is the one posited by the nominalist, by nominalism. According to nominalism, the universal is nothing but a word, flatus vocis, puff of air. So when I say man, it's just a word. Tree is just a word. And this word can actually be divided into syllables or letters. So nominalism is just a name. And we can use any other name to represent the universal. The realist, on the other hand, asserts that there is the existence of real universal in and before particular things. Meaning, they accept the idea about there is universal in particular things, like the idea of books in books, and before things, meaning before the things before the particular things that will manifest them, there are there is already a universal. This conception originated, of course, from Plato's notion of the forms which exist in the world of forms, independent of the mind, and are therefore prior to particular individuals or particular things. Okay? So that's the answer of the realist, that the universal have an independent existence, okay, independent of the mind. Okay? They exist in it in themselves. They also exist in particular things. Now, the nominalist and the realist solutions to Porphyry's problem are just too simplistic, and they are not properly distinguished. So, the three distinctions of Albert the Great about the universals allowed him to harmonize Plato's realism. Of course, for Plato, there is the universals that exist as separate forms in the world of forms. So they exist in themselves. And he harmonized that with Plato's more nominalistic, actually, Plato's position on the universals uh, as applied by Thomas Aquinas is a more moderate realism. Okay, a moderate realism. Okay, so his theory of the immanent forms, the universals, when considered in themselves, truly exist and are free from generation, corruption, and change, based, of course, on Plato's assertion about the forms. If, however, they are taken in reference to the mind, meaning as existing in the mind, and therefore it's a mental construction, they exist in two modes, depending on whether they are considered with respect to the intellect as the cause, meaning it's a construction of the intellect, or the intellect that knows them by abstraction. So when you say abstraction, that means it is now the object, it's now the universal taken from particular things. That's actually the third distinction of Albert the Great. But when they are considered in particular things, their existence is exterior to as well as beyond the mind. Okay? Yet they exist in things as individuated, meaning the universal, for example, man can exist in me as a man, but it is now individuated because it exists in a particular man. So it exists in itself, it can exist in the mind, or it can exist in particular things. This is the moderate realism. No, many writers call it moderate realism solution to the problem of universals. So let's go now to psychology and his notion of man, his anthropology. Now, St. Albert's thought on the human being is focused on his concern with the relationship of the soul to the body and the important role that the intellect plays in human psychology. According to St. Albert, man is identified with his intellect. And by intellect, he actually meant the soul, because remember the in his metaphysics, the hierarchy of beings. In explaining the relationship between the soul and the body, St. Albert mediated between the Platonic theory, which regards the soul as a form capable of existing independently of the body, and the Aristotelian hylomorphic theory, which reduces the soul to a functional relationship of the body. These are actually two different philosophies as far as the nature of the soul, because Plato already posited that the soul pre-existed in the world of forms, and then it is entangled in the body. It can exist independent of the body. It is the one that controls the body. No? So the body is like a secondary entity for Plato. For Aristotle, of course, based on his hylomorphic theory, we have the matter and form, and then you have the substantial form of the soul, and it's the one that actualizes the body. So it has this function of actualizing the body. Now, with respect to knowledge, for Saint Albert, the human intellect, the soul, is dependent upon the senses. No? Because again, following Aristotle, nothing in the mind that did not pass through the senses. So it is dependent on the senses because it will need the data of the senses to perform the process of abstraction. Okay? So to resolve the conflict between the two views, Saint Albert posited following Avicenna that Aristotle's analysis was more focused on the function and not the very essence of the soul. The essence of the soul is explained by Plato. Aristotle, on the other hand, focused more on the function of the soul in relation to the body. Okay? So, functionally, the soul is the agent cause of the body. It's the one that activates the body. The soul is the cause of the animated body and of its motions and passions, insofar as the body is animated. That's why the soul is also called anima. Okay? Anima. So it's the one that animates. It's the one that gives life to the body. The body is lifeless without the soul. With the soul, it becomes animated, and therefore it can function as a body. It can function in its emotions and passions. Now, the human body, and this is now based on Christian theology, that the human soul was created in the image and likeness of God. So that's not Aristotelian. That's already Christian theology. Okay, so it's created in the image of likeness of God, and therefore it does not only govern the body. No, it's not only govern the body. It governs the body, but more than that, in the same manner that God governs the world or the universe, it is also responsible for the very existence of the body, in as much as God is responsible for the existence of, you know, of the world. So he's making an analogy here. And just as God transcends his creation, so does the human soul transcends the body in its interests. Okay, so there is something to the soul that is beyond the body. The soul will unite with God, not the body. Of course, we say that at the end of time, there will be the resurrection of the body. But it is already a spiritualized body. Spiritualized body. I don't know how this spiritualized body will be of Christ, the risen Christ, will be accommodated in the philosophy of the scholastics, because, like for example, Thomas and uh, Albert the Great denied the universal hylomorphic, that there is no such thing as spiritual body, while the Franciscans, they talk about spiritualized body. So are the Franciscans referring could be referring to the spiritualized body of the risen Christ? We don't know. Maybe, no? Maybe that could be one application. So therefore, the human soul is capable of operating completely independent of corporeal function. The essence of the soul is the human intellect as an intelligence, no? Following the metaphysics of Albert the Great. Now, as an intellect, the human soul is an incorporeal or spiritual substance, definitely. As spiritual substance, it has two powers: the agent intellect and the passive or possible intellect. Now, those of us who are familiar with the psychology of St. Thomas, this distinction is the same as St. Thomas. These powers do not need the body in order to function. Okay? Now, now this is where uh, St. Albert differs from St. Thomas. Under certain conditions concerning its powers, the human intellect is capable of transformation, and the intellect is susceptible to illumination by higher cosmic intellect, the intelligences. Now, remember the metaphysics of Albert the Great about the intelligences, no? The spiritual beings. Such illumination brings the soul of man into complete harmony with the entire order of creation and constitutes man's natural happiness. Since the intellect is now totally assimilated in the order of things, St. Albert calls the intellect in its final stage of development as assimilated intellect. Okay? Assimilated intellect. Now, this condition of having attained an assimilated intellect constitutes natural human happiness, realizing all the aspirations of the human condition and human culture. Okay? So, this is now the natural human happiness. I don't know how, if this is similar to beatific vision. I don't know, because beatific vision is, of course, this is just let's explain how this happens, and then we can probably uh, compare this to the idea of beatific vision. According to Saint Albert, following Saint Augustine, because the divine truth lies beyond our reason, meaning the human mind cannot attain this on its own, we are not able by ourselves to discover it unless it condescends to infuse itself. So for St. Augustine, this is how St. Augustine puts it: there is an inner teacher without whom an external teacher labors endlessly. So the external teacher, our own intellect, but there is an inner teacher in us. There is thus an infusion involved with divine illumination, an infusion of an inner teacher who is identified with divine truth itself. Okay? So this, I don't know how to put this, but this would be some sort of a divine spark inside us, okay? Identified with the divine light itself. This inner teacher strengthens the weakness of the human intellect, by which by itself could not profit by external stimulation. That's why Albert the Great, uh, of course, he accepts that through external experience we can gain access, no? We can know the natural things, but when it comes to the divine things, we will need this inner teacher. Saint Albert distinguishes the illumination of this inner teacher from the true and final object of the intellect, which is God Himself. So the inner teacher is different from the divine intellect. No? Divine light is only a means by which the intellect can attain its object. So in order for in the order of human knowing, there are first of all the forms that are derived from external things. Okay, so in the natural order of things, we know the natural things, we know the external things. They teach us anything in any way, anything in any useful way, until the light of an inner teacher illuminates them. So here he is really following the illumination of Saint Augustine. So light in the medium of this vision, no? Light is the medium of this vision. But the inner teacher is identified with divine truth, which is the final object and perfection of the human intellect. Okay. Now, as to the object of human knowledge, from in the natural order, we know natural things, we receive them through our natural light, but the intellect that contemplates in the order of belief, meaning in those divine matters, are received in a light that is gratuitous, and the beautifying realities are received in the light of glory, meaning from the divine light. Okay, let's move uh, faster so that we can have more time for some of your questions. Now, ethics. St. Albert's ethics is based on his understanding of freedom. And because among many other things, I will just focus on the free will. Freedom, human freedom, is expressed through the human power or the free will, liberum arbitrium, to make unrestricted decisions about one action or one's action. This power is not identified with the intellect nor with the will, although later he would somehow uh, modify this particular view and say that this is actually it also follows the dictate of the intellect, no? The knowledge based on the intellect. In his analysis of the genesis of human action, Saint Albert accounts for human action, which begins with the intellect, which considers various options for action, which is open to a person at a given situation. So you have several options in this particular situation, what you're going to do. Then the free will chooses one of the options proposed by the intellect or the object of the will's desire. So the will then moves the person to act based on the action of the free will. So the free will is conditioned by both the intellect and by the will. Okay. Now, Albert also considered some problems about the discipline of ethics. One is whether ethics can be considered as a theoretical deductive science. And he said that it can be considered a science because the underlying causes of moral action, the rationis morum, involve both the necessary and universal principles. These are conditions that are needed for a science according to Aristotle. Okay. So far we have covered his ethics, metaphysics, his logic, his psychology, and his ethics. Now let's go to the significance of St. Albert's philosophy. St. Albert's influence in the development of scholastic philosophy in the 13th century was enormous. He, along with his most famous student, St. Thomas Aquinas, succeeded in incorporating the philosophy of Aristotle into the Christian West, Christian world. The influence of St. Albert and his students were pronounced in the generation of German scholars who came after them. St. Albert's philosophy in particular can be considered as the result of the Christian reception of Aristotle and Western Europe. St. Albert the Great, however, also has a strong bias in favor of Neoplatonism. We have seen in our discussion, no? His bias for Neoplatonism and even for the philosophy of St. Augustine, which blended well with his deep understanding of the Aristotelian ideas. Along with his student St. Thomas Aquinas, he believed that Aristotle and his branch of natural philosophy did not present obstacle to the development of a Christian philosophical vision of the natural order. And to establish this point, St. Albert analyzed carefully the method that Aristotle used in expounding natural philosophy. This method, according to St. Albert, is experientially based and proceeds to draw conclusions through inductive and deductive logic. Christian theology, as taught in Europe at the time, is based solidly upon the revelation of the sacred scripture and the church fathers. So for St. Albert, the two domains of human culture, natural philosophy on one hand and Christian theology on the other hand, are distinct in their methodology and pose no threat to each other, and therefore can be pursued for their own sake. Therefore, philosophy was not to be valued only in terms of its ancillary relation to theology. The common notion that in the medieval period, philosophy is an handmaid of theology. Of course, there are opinions of recent scholars that St. Albert subordinated his use of Aristotle to his understanding of Neoplatonics of the Neoplatonic view of reality that he found in the writings of Pseudo Dionysius and the Liber de Causis. He saw all of reality in terms of Neoplatonic categories of exit and return, the exitus and perfectio, which he referred to in his writings with the terms exitus, perfectio, and reductio. This is similar to the three parts of the philosophy of Saint Augustine: the descent, then the works, and then the return. This schema gave him a framework into which he could develop the scientific insights of Aristotle. So again, there's always a good blend. You know, Saint Albert was able to have a good mix of Aristotelian and Neoplatonic philosophies. Nevertheless, not all the authorities he cited, relied on, have the same influence on him, as he expressly said in the Summa Theologiae, his unfinished Summa Theologiae, that in matters of faith and morals, St. Augustine was the first. In matters of faith and morals, St. Augustine was the first. In medicine, the opinions of Galen and Hippocrates were to be preferred. And in the study of the nature of things, Aristotle is the best authority. Thus, St. Albert became the main figure in the medieval world as a source and transmitter of the Greco-Roman Arabic literary tradition. And in spite of his open admiration for Aristotle, he was well aware of the limitation of Aristotle's philosophy when applied to the exposition of Catholic dogma. So, for example, he knew that the Aristotelian universe was limited, although eternal, without any reference to a creator. That the divinity of Aristotelianism was an immobile being that keeps in motion the heavenly spheres. A pure spirit, but who is not the creator of the universe, and a constitutive element of and immersed in the cosmos. So different from the Catholic belief. Neither was there in Aristotle's philosophy any hint of a transcendent end of man, the eternal happiness in the company of God. And consequently, his psychology developed outside of, and at times, contrary to Christian eschatology. His doctrine of the soul speaks of an immortal human soul, but that Aristotelian conception of soul is impersonal and supra-individual. So you see here that he knows the limits, he understood the limits of Aristotle's philosophy. Now, St. Albert's writings are surely abundant, but they're not very systematic. If you're going, especially if you're going to compare his writings with the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. In fact, he was very impressed of St. Thomas when he chanced upon the writings of the handouts, the notes taken by St. Thomas. I think he was giving his lecture on Dionysius the Areopagite, no, the pseudo Dionysius, and he read the notes taken by St. Thomas, and he was impressed, and he decided to test St. Thomas. So, there are two forms of uh, class, no, uh, activities in the class, lectio and disputatio. So he assigned St. Thomas to a disputatio with a fellow students. No? So, and that's where after St. Thomas performed in that disputatio, that's where St. Albert said, well, you call him a dove-steated ox, mark my word, one day his bellowing will startle the world. So that impressed really St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas. The disorder that is evident in many of his works gave rise to an interesting controversy in recent years as to whether he was able to construct his own personal philosophy. And if ever, what orientation such a synthesis took. Some commentators held the opinion that he was an exceptional erudite and compiler, a fact that makes him deserve a special place in the history of scholasticism, but that he was not capable of producing a personal synthesis. But there are also those who regard St. Albert the Great, as attested by his contemporaries, as an independent and original thinker who expressed in his writings ideas which are truly his own. He could even be considered the creator of philosophy in the Latin cultural milieu. He was far from being a blind follower of Aristotle in any of the trends prevailing in the 13th century of Europe. He saw the achievements of Aristotle as the summit of human thought, but it was clear to him that Aristotle was not infallible. So in expounding on Aristotle's teaching, which were incompatible with Christianity, he did not hesitate to single out their limitations. And consequently, he can be rightly considered as the founder of Christian Aristotelianism. Now, of course, we always associate St. Albert and St. Thomas. So for the last part, I'll be talking about the thoughts of these two uh, scholastic philosophers. Excuse me. St. Thomas Aquinas received all his philosophical, theological training under St. Albert the Great. First, during his 3 years in Paris, from when he arrived in 1245 until 1248, when uh, St. Albert the Great was sent to Cologne, and actually St. Thomas accompanied him to Cologne. So he studied for 4 years in Cologne under St. Albert the Great from 1248 to 1252. Okay, so 1252 he finished his theological studies, and then he continued studying in Paris. Went to Paris. St. Thomas went to Paris for his masteral in theology and sacred books, which he finished in 1257. And 1257 he was accepted in the master's order. St. Thomas attended his commentaries or lectures on the sentences of Peter Lombard, the complete works of Pseudo Dionysius, the Nicomachean Ethics, and the various books of the Old and New Testaments. His 7 years of studying under such a great mind as St. Albert's could have easily negated the disciples' spontaneity by determining his doctrinal orientation, or you just patterned your orientation with your master. However, apart from some points wherein they agree, their differences are so pronounced that it can be said that their philosophies are in essence different from one another. So while it is true that St. Albert is the teacher of St. Thomas, and St. Thomas owed much to St. Albert, but their philosophies are different. No? So let's just enumerate some of the points that they share. They share, they agree that all creation is composed of code esse, meaning essence, and esse, existence. All creation, all created beings, essence and existence. Only God, the creator, where we find the code esse and the esse, code es and esse are the same. God is both his essence and existence. Second, they both agree that prime matter is pure potency, that it is neither intelligible by itself nor does it subsist in itself. Because considered in itself, prime matter is devoid of any form. Second or third, that in all beings that are composed, meaning composed of body and soul, no? Man included, there is only one substantial form. Okay, there's only one substantial form. So there's body, and then there's the substantial form. Okay. Next, and of course, they also agree that the soul has one intellect. There's no such thing as unity of all intellects. Okay. Fourth, that the concept of a spiritual matter is contradictory. They both rejected universal hylomorphism. It means all creatures, including the angels, have matter and form. That for them is impossible. Lastly, both philosophers emphasize the superiority of the intellect over the will, since nothing can be desired unless it has been previously known. Okay? Although they add that in the present state of man, we as a viator, we are here on earth, the will usually exerts a certain control over the intellect. Because based on experience, sometimes the will can prevail over the intellect. Now, there are differences. St. Albert maintained that intellectual activity, specifically in the highest levels of mystical union, is carried out without the need of images or phantasm. As we have discussed, he followed Saint Augustine's divine illumination here in the highest level of mystical union. Saint Thomas, on the other hand, always taught that in this lifetime, as a viator, we cannot maintain this intellectual activity without having recourse to images or phantasm. So there will always be a phantasm. There will always be an image. There will always be an impressed species, okay? An image. So that's why in the idiogenesis, in the theory of abstraction, Saint Thomas maintained that there's no such thing as a higher capacity of intellectual union. Now, second, Saint Albert identified being eternal with being uncreated. No? Eternal is always uncreated. Consequently, considered it contradictory that a world that is eternal were created. It cannot be both eternal and created. Okay? So if it is eternal, it should be uncreated. St. Thomas, on the other hand, considers that eternity does not exclude being created. So meaning it, it something can be created but eternal. It only means that not having a beginning in time. Okay. So from the metaphysical point of view, therefore, he found no obstacle in thinking of a being created eternally. Okay? Being created eternally. Of course, it will depend on God because God can still exterminate this created being eternally. The universal doctor, next, meaning Saint Albert the Great, did not identify the angels with the separated substances of the Aristotelians that caused the movement of heavenly spheres. No, so the separate because he followed the the Neoplatonic idea of the remember the Proclus, no, the celestial spheres, no, in his metaphysics. So there are the angels and the spiritual beings, the other the intelligences. In contrast, the angelic doctor considered them the same, metaphysically speaking. In his mind, it is only through revelation that we can know that angels are messengers of God, that they are at His service. Okay, so, all right. Next, number 4. Saint Albert the Great held that the human embryo develops progressively in such a way that from the very beginning of its growth, everything is already present, including its intelligence. Again, this is somehow similar to the seminal reason of Saint Augustine. Everything is already there, waiting to be, to be actualized. In contrast, Saint Thomas Aquinas taught that the human embryo becomes an individual of the human species only after a series of generations and corruptions. Meaning, after various substantial changes, most important of it being the infusion of the spiritual soul some weeks after fertilization. This is the doctrine of delayed infusion of the soul. No? Okay. Now, lastly, Saint Albert and Saint Thomas also differed as to the ontological or metaphysical composition of finite being, meaning the created beings. According to Sigurd Brabant, contemporary of the two, Saint Albert understood esse, meaning existence, as something extrinsic to the essence and in some way accidental to it. In God, essence and existence are the same. No, so to be is to exist for God, but for Albert, to be does not always mean to exist. Esse is something that is added. No, it's not something extrinsic. No, rather it is something outside, and then it is added as a kind of, in some sense, accident. On the other hand, Saint Thomas stated that esse, meaning existence, is something added to the essence of a thing as part of its essential constitution, not something accidental to it. So meaning to be for St. Thomas is to exist. Okay, to be is to exist. Because there's still the duality of essence and existence. There's still the duality of could est and esse, but it is not something accidental because it is something essential to the very constitution of the esse, or the essence of, or could est, or the essence of particular things. So those are some of the differences between these two medieval thinkers. Okay, so I stop there. I don't know if you still have some questions. This is a rather long presentation of Saint Albert the Great. We just scratch the surface of his philosophy.